Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this short webinar about DDoS protection and configuration and why it matters. Today we have with us Frits Plessius from Xpand-Net. I'm Amit Morson, VP Services here at MazeBolt. Frits, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Well, I'm Frits Plessius, Manager Operations for the network and security within Xpand-Net. What we do is we provide professional services for customers to support the installation of deployment with mitigation systems, firewalls, WAFs, and also solutions like CGN, ADC, GDP firewall, and SSL Lite. Plus, we have various types of cloud services that we support, and of course, vendors like A10, which we are professional services for. But we also support F5, Netscaler, Arbor, Fortinet, Palo Alto, Juniper, and Cisco, and so forth. So that's roughly what we do. We also, next to that, is the vulnerability scan with all the installations that have been done is actually a must.
Seems like a lot of your work is around network protection devices. When you go through a deployment like that, what would you say are the main issues that you encounter post like physical deployment? What kind of issues are you seeing during those processes?
With the physical deployments, it's sometimes the part of, for instance, setting up the mitigation is not really in the design in how the application and the customer has its on-premises network. It's or sometimes overscaled or underscaled. We see parts in there, and we also see parts in particular things whereby a certain design is being laid out, but it's like a default design and it's not fully to the customer's needs. Like for instance with cloud scrubbing or something like that, or CGN, where we sometimes see these differences.
When a deployment is done of some kind of a solution, basically we concentrate on DDoS solution.
Yeah.
When you try to understand how much does the solution cover or really provide protection, what are the measures like in the past that you did to understand what kind of protection the customers are getting post deployment?
Mostly what we do is we investigate ourselves with the customer to see what they have and how they are mitigating their security standpoints, which sometimes is, how would we say, sometimes is like they have a lot of equipment like WAF or even TPS or IPS mitigation systems, whereby everything is like standard out of the box. There is no real tuning to the needs of the customer. The framework is not there, which you actually are looking for to comply. And yeah, that's a part which we miss. And I would say a one-size-fits-all profile that really doesn't exist. And that's what we mostly see. And then we start tuning with the customer to get a better picture.
How did the tuning process does look like in those environments when you start working and you understanding like the initial, obviously we have the initial configuration. Most customers know their networks and the different services they have, but then you need to get into the little stuff like the coverage of specific things or specific issues. What's the process like into finding all of those different issues beyond just the scope of the network or the main services of that network?
I can take you an example of MazeBolt and the app itself. Like when we do DDoS vulnerability testing, and we scan the network, we check Yeah, we look for the vulnerability. Then when we've done that, we start to mitigate, we start to investigate what do we need to mitigate and what are our thresholds, because that's what we see as well. Sometimes thresholds are way too low, and other instances they're way too high, so they hardly have any function. And next to that is when we've done that, we start, of course, deploying it, checking if everything is done, and then we do full circle. And we need to keep testing what we've deployed, because especially when you get the point when you have done the tuning with the customer and done all the basic steps,
Right.
is to keep that level. That's what we see as well. You see a lot of companies that set the things up, um, then we have everything deployed and we don't touch it for a year.
Okay.
It's a bit of a killer.
Through testing, we've seen a lot of that. Threshold is a big thing. Using filters is another. Uh, you know, in many of the tests, we've seen that customers are just not using the right controls that you have with those mitigations, or some
Yeah.
of those mitigations allow you to use very sophisticated mechanisms. And we've seen in some cases that customers do not trust those
Oh, yes,
mechanisms, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
We've seen like a filter or a threshold is very straightforward. You have the rate, so it's very mechanic, I would say,
Yeah.
even though it's all logical, right? But then you have the smarter filters, like behavioral DDoS and things like that. And sometimes we see that it's either lack of trust or just lack of familiarity with those kind of filters. A lot of the times, those smart filters act better than just a static set, right?
That's
Either a
correct.
filter or a threshold, or you can uh, combine a lot of the times those thresholds with the smart mitigation in order to get even the best result, right?
Correct.
So we've seen that. Another thing that we've seen, and I think we talked about it in the past, is um, that some traffic flows are completely bypassing the mitigation. Right? So there's
Yeah.
like an area of the network or specific services that are
And
not
on top of,
even.
now I wanted to say about bypassing, on top of that is what we recently seen, and we discussed this also previously, is that, for instance, on the WAF deployment that we had, there was a problem. They discontinued the WAF and
Mm,
they never turned it on. Yeah, that's the trust part. Or the other part of trust, we place it in learning and we leave it in learning.
right. Yeah.
The downside is in leaving it in learning, it learns so much that it also learns the bad stuff. And then you come to the trust issue, because when you then turn it on, it doesn't work how it's supposed to. And people leave it then in a kind of a bypass, which you just discussed. Yeah, that's exactly what we see reasonably often. And the out of the box deployment, and it should work, plug and play. That's it.
When you get to those kind of processes, are there any specific like cases that you can remember that were really like, how would I describe it? Weird or inconsistent with other customers that you've seen?
I've yeah, I've one thing was really funny was one customer, he had everything deployed, and this was on the WAF by the case, had everything deployed on port 80 as his WAF, but on port 80 was a redirect towards port 443, and there was no WAF. So, and then under the impression that you first go through the WAF and then get redirected. No, that is not the case by load balancers, but that's one of them. The other part is we've seen an anti-DDoS mitigation system, which was fully in bypass. We were not under attack. And I
Hmm.
was like, okay. So when do you know when you are under attack? Yeah, that's when the firewall's going to complain, probably. And then we turn it on. So that's the lack of trust again. Yeah, you always will fall a little bit back on that, unfortunately. Yeah, those are, I think, the two most odd ones that we see in a reasonable repetitive pattern, to be honest.
I wanted to talk about a little bit of we see these issues, but we don't really always know how to find them and to solve them. Like how do you know that a specific service is vulnerable to something? How do you know that a specific DDoS attack in our case may impact the entire network, which is usually the case in layer 3 and 4 DDoS attacks, or a specific service that is more common with specific services. One of the things that we do here basically is trying to find those specific issues and then go and make the right correction, basically understand what the issue might be with the mitigation. When we talk about uh, almost all, basically the premise is that almost all mitigation systems can stop almost all DDoS attacks, right? So it doesn't matter which kind of solution you deploy, they usually, at least the big and familiar solution, have a way to stop it. You just need to configure it correctly. Right? So
Yeah, and have the knowledge about how your app is doing and how the attack is coming towards you, indeed.
it's a combination of having the right mitigation that when we look at the 3 and 4 protections, there are 7 protections of any of the vendors, and also understand once you have those solutions, how to configure them correctly and validate that you configure them correctly.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the validation process. Like how do you really go about checking which service is vulnerable to what? I wanted to share something here that exemplify exactly that. And this is something that we did with a customer. Obviously, we're not going to expose which and what, but I want to explain what we're seeing on the screen right now. In this case, we worked with a customer on a specific vector on a specific target, UDP garbage flood attack. This is the attack that we found it vulnerable. In this case, they had a CPE, which is an on-premise protection device, and a scrubbing center, right? These are the relevant protection layers for a layer 4 attack. And basically, we can see the history of testing this specific attack at this customer. Initially, what we've seen is that we ran the first test. In this case, it's 28th of August 24. And we've seen that the scrubbing center is vulnerable to this attack. Basically, almost all the traffic of that attack leaked through the scrubbing center and eventually was stopped by the CPE, by the on-premise device. Almost all of the attack was stopped here. Now, the issue here, you'd say, okay, the end result is that the customer is protected, the on-premise device stopped all the traffic, but what we see here is basically that everything penetrated the scrubbing center. This traffic actually reached the customer network, so unnecessary traffic was in the customer network. And in case if this was a real extremely volumetric attack, it would basically clog their line, right? So there's no defense before the line. All the traffic is going through. And if in case that it was a real volumetric attack, basically the customer would be down because their entire internet line would be completely clogged. So we worked with this customer, basically make a few modifications in their scrubbing center configuration. Then about 3 weeks later, we tested again. And in the second test, we've seen that almost everything was stopped. Like 18.5% of the traffic still managed to leak. all things considered, this is considered protected. We know that mitigation devices, sometimes it takes a little bit of while to recognize, identify the attack, and basically stop it. So a little bit of traffic going through is usually normal to most kind of attacks, especially when we look at behavioral or more sophisticated kind of defenses. They need to recognize the attack before they can stop it. So a little bit of leakage is usually fine. We continued working with this customer on other issues that were fine, and then additional modifications were done to the scrubbing center, and then we see that the layer test, right, in a different cycle of validation, we tested again and seen that everything is stopped. Basically, zero traffic penetrated the scrubbing center and the CPE, and basically the customer ended up being completely protected from those kind of attacks, and nothing is leaking through the protection. This is basically where we want to be. Right? So going through this process of testing and understanding what's going on really can improve the entire protection of all of the assets and all of the services that the customer provide, and against all types of attacks. We see an example of one attack here. Obviously, when we run those cycles, we run many different attacks, and we can see through this process of understanding what is vulnerable and fixing those vulnerabilities, get to a very high level of protection. Fritz, I've know you've been involved a little bit in those processes. How would you compare as basically a user doing this process in the old way versus what we can do and what this technology enable us to do now?
Having this in the old way is, to be really honest, without using your tool, you will have about 5 to 7 volumetric attack types that you can test during a window.
Right.
And the nice part about this is that you have the radar on the inside of your network, which mitigates everything, well, which transmits all the packets that were leaked back into the tool, so you have the full visibility of what is happening through your network. The other part is you don't have the full outage that you need to test with the current standard DDoS testing, whereby you're trying to kill your box. And yeah, that's the case. What they do mostly with the red tests. And in this case, we just test up until certain limits, what we do with your tool as well. And as soon as the mitigation kicks in where it should kick in, you don't need to test further, because at this stage it's kicking in. And you keep that repeative cycle of testing. That's the most important part, having that repeative part of testing, which is now also reasonably coming up with Indora, which they also are requesting by having those repeative testing to make sure that your network doesn't fall back and has an open vulnerability again.
It's actually interesting that you bring that up, because we've seen in the past doing a lot of the heavy lifting, right? When you deploy a new solution, you switch a solution, or you're just starting, testing, regularly for vulnerabilities. There's usually some work involved in getting to the 98 or 99 or 90 something level of protection in DDoS. And we worked with many customers and got to these levels. And then, you can rest for a while, but then a lot of the customers, because of the requirements of compliances, or just because they want to be secured, after a couple of months, they will run another test. And what we've seen, in many cases, that after a while there are degradations. Now,
Yeah.
you don't expect it, because networks can change, but they don't change very often. Right? People don't infra teams, right? I think that anyone here that is familiar and is part of this industry are not really enthusiastic about making a lot of change in their networks. But what we do see, like in one case with one of our customers, we ran after we got to a very high level of protection, and we ran again. Then we saw some uh, uh, assets, some services that were protected in the past, and now they are vulnerable. So we try to understand what's going on, and we found out that one of their cloud protection services updated the version. And what happened, and this we found out like in hindsight after investigating with the cloud provider, is that the new version of their basically software, like cloud software, impacted the way that policies are interpreted, right? So because what the customer set in their protection policies because of the new version had a different effect. Right? Basically, they never admitted if the bug was before the change or after the change, but the customer had to change the policy in order to be protected again after this version change. So we've seen cases when we instructed a cloud provider to make changes on their end to things that the customers did not have access to, and they made the wrong change, right? So you run a validation again, and wait, this is not what we asked for. You completely took a critical service out of the policy instead of making a change, right? So when we do revalidation, a lot of the time we see that things change not necessarily in the network or in the services, which happens sometimes as well, but also on the protection side. So beside just the necessity to do it for compliance, just making sure that things are still protected is extremely important. And we've seen time and time again that things do not stay the same, even though you expect them to stay
Yeah.
that way.
And we've seen this as well on hardware devices like a firewall or a WAF, or a software WAF that's in the cloud. We've seen exactly the same as you described.
Actually, I think time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yes, I see.
we have only a few minutes left, so I want to look and see if we have some questions from the crowd before we end this. And I have a question here. How do you prioritize which DDoS vulnerabilities to remediate? Is it possible to automate remediation recommendations? Okay, so there are two ways that we prioritize which DDoS vulnerabilities to remediate. Of course, I know that every customer that worked with us have seen that running those tests, you can find multiple vulnerabilities in multiple services. So how do you decide what to fix first? Usually teams have a lot of duties, a lot of tasks. So how do you really decide what you want to do to fix first? There are two ways to do it. There is the way in the product. When you look in the dashboard of Radar, basically it will tell you how many targets or services are impacted by this vulnerability, right? So if there is one vulnerability, one specific DDoS attack that will impact 50 or 60 or 17 different services, obviously you want to fix that first. You want to fix the specific uh, attacks that impact a lot of targets, right? So fixing this one, making this one configuration change will provide protection to a lot of your services. Another way to do it is through our professional services. Our teams are very familiar with what's going on. Obviously, very risky attacks you want to fix first. Attacks that are very common in the wild right now, and the likelihood of getting attacked by those specific attacks, you obviously want to fix first. So a combination of what Radar automatically recommends you by impact and what's actually going on in the field and what is dangerous by the PS team. This is a combination that can assist you what you want to fix first. We have time for one more question. How do you regularly frameworks like DOA and SEC cyber rules influence? So this is basically how regulatory frameworks like DOA or SEC influence configuration decisions for DDoS defense layers. And Fritz, this is exactly connects to what you said about regulations, and we've seen one of the main principles of DORA, basically among the things that DORA advocates is resilience. Obviously, this is the whole idea of DORA, but what DORA brings to the table, which is new, and we see it in the new generation of regulations and compliances, is the notion of continuous testing, right? So if in the past, and everyone who's in cybersecurity or in compliance and worked in a CISO office knows, when you come to the audit, you prepare for the audit. It's a yearly audit, so you prepare everything. So it's kind of in a lot of things a 1 year thing. What DORA enforces is the notion of continuousness, right? You need to test all the time. You cannot just test before the audit. You need to test all the time. You need to make sure if it's cyber, if it's resilience, if it's infrastructure, you always have to have a process of testing what you're doing. And one of the difficult things with the old style of testing DDoS was basically a red team test is very inconvenient, right? You need to be down, you need to have a maintenance window. Usually you want to do it in the middle of the night and you need to have the teams there.
Don't forget your stakeholders.
Yeah,
You need to
exactly.
explain everything to.
Right. So imagine you can do that in a press of a button, right? With no disruption and doing all the time. So this is a big advantage, the ability to have continuous testing on schedule, right? Uh, Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. So thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you very much, and enjoy the
Okay.
rest of the day.